All right, good morning, Grace Bible Church. Welcome to this Lord's Day. We are continuing in our series of considering Old Testament characters. While all Old Testament characters are important, if you were to be asked who is the most well known, who is the more prominent one, the important figure in the Old Testament, most would probably say Moses. And you would not be alone there, for researchers report that about 80% of Americans who were polled as to who the most important character in the Old Testament is, they say Moses. And again, humanly speaking, this is just our own assessment of things. Humanly speaking, Moses, yes, is an important character, but and it's understandable, right? He's recorded in much of the Old Testament. He's written a lot of the Old Testament. He went on Mount Sinai and received the law and the Ten Commandments. He even delivered Israel from Egyptian bondage. So, absolutely, Moses is an important character in the Old Testament. But if you look at it another way, when you look at it in God's broader redemptive plan, Abraham, to me, is at the top of the list. Abraham is at the top of the list because it is the beginning post flood of God's redemptive plan. Again, post flood, the flood didn't wash away sins because sin is inside of man. And then we have the explosion of the total depravity of humanity at the Tower of Babel. And then God raises up Abraham, and it is through Abraham that he begins his redemptive plan to pre-fall kingdom living. Pre-fall kingdom living, God begins through Abraham. And through Abraham, specifically the blessings, namely his seed, his offspring. And it is through Abraham and Abraham's seed that God promises to bless all nations. And this is where we come in, folks, which includes you and me. That's a pretty profound thought, right? That we're looking at a guy who lived a long time ago. And in this man, God began his redemptive plan to save you. It's crazy. It's crazy to think about, but it's true, isn't it? It is through Abraham and his promised seed that God carries out his redemptive plan. And here we go. By using and through Abraham's faith. And I'm just going to lay the tension out there right now. And I'm actually not even going to touch on it through this message, okay? At least I don't think I'm going to. But that tension that all of us are aware of is this. You have God's sovereign grace as a railroad track or one rail of a track. And on the other side of the railroad track is another rail, and that's called human responsibility. Leave them both there. And so as we work through this sovereign redemptive plan of God to redeem all nations, it is through the responsibility of man, faith of humanity, particularly this Old Testament character of Abraham's faith. And it is a faith in God's redemptive plan that continues from Abraham all the way to today, which is why we would do well to take a closer look at Abraham's faith. I have about 100 pictures on my iPhone. I just deleted a bunch last night because it told me to pay $1 so I have more storage. I deleted some of my kids' photos, but I kept all the grandkid photos, right? But if you, and there's such a I don't know what it is on an iPhone, something like a memory album or something like that. All I know is because one time I picked it up and it's like, this is interesting. It's doing something. It's like it'll give you a photo and then it switches to another photo and then another photo. Okay. And I don't think I asked it to do that, but it did that. That thought came to mind. That's what we're going to do this morning. We're looking at a photo collage of the life of Abraham's faith. And I'm going to throw out there 4 photos, snapshots. Don't get agitated or squirm in your seat if like a photo switched around. Like that's not the proper order. That's not how it's supposed to be. It's a pull back photo collage of Abraham's faith. That's what we're doing here, okay? And so that's how we're going to walk through Abraham's faith. This really is about a 12-week study, by the way. This is one of those studies that would do well to take place in a classroom over there in the Worrell Hall with a whiteboard, and everybody's got their Bibles out and pens. We're just not doing that this morning. And one Sunday, we're going to look at Abraham's life of faith through 4 photos. We're going to take a closer look because it is helpful for us in our faith as we respond to God's sovereign grace and ultimately see Jesus. That's the point. Okay? God's sovereign, redemptive plan of grace to which humanity responds to. And at the end, we'll see Jesus. Okay? First photo, let's walk into Genesis chapter 12. I'm not going to reread the whole thing, just a couple verses. Pete read it for us this morning. Genesis chapter 12. First of all, we see this. Abraham's faith, you can follow along on the screens if you want. Abraham's faith is active. Abraham's faith is active. Look at chapter 12. Now the Lord said to Abram, and I'm going to say Abraham at times, like if you're one of those like, nope, it's Abram right now. Be gracious, okay? And same with Sarai. It's just going to come out Sarah for obvious reasons. My wife's name's Sarah. Lord said to Abram, go from your country and your kindred and your father's house to the land that I will show you, and I will make of you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great so that you'll be a blessing. I will bless those who bless you, and him who dishonors you will curse, and in you all the families of the earth shall be blessed. And Abram went. If you're living in New York City, in one of those apartment towers with millions and millions, and I don't know how many lives in New York City, and you've got your wife in your apartment and your parents in your apartment, and you're just minding your own business, doing life, you work during the week, and you have fun on weekends, and all of a sudden you get a letter, and the letter's from the Lord to you, and the letter says this: Abraham, you don't know me because you're an unbeliever. You worship a bunch of other stuff. But Abram, here's what I want you to do. I want you to leave New York City, and I want you to travel 700 miles to Greenwood, Indiana. And I'm going to give you a piece of land. Not only am I going to give you a piece of land, I'm going to make you a very prominent character in your community, and actually not only in your own community, but in the United States, and you're going to be looked upon. And not only is that going to happen, but I'm going to give you a kid, and I'm going to give you a bunch of kids so that those kids become an entire nation. But not only that, you're going to be such a great nation that anyone that blesses you, I'm going to bless them, and anyone that curses you, I'm going to curse them. And if that's not enough, through you, Abraham, and your seed and your seeds, all people will be blessed. But you don't know the Lord. In fact, you are a worshiper of other gods, Joshua 24 tells us. You're a pagan, and your mom and daddy are pagans. And you live in a pagan country, but you get this message from the Lord. You go? You're like, I would love to get out of New York City. Maybe I should flip it around. I'm going to give you this land. I'm going to bless you. I'm going to bless you with the family, and you're going to bless everybody. But you don't know the Lord. Do you go? Sometimes we just quickly overlook these few couple verses of chapter 12. Abraham left his friends, his land, where he had crops, I'm sure, an occupation. He left the familiarity around him to go to a place that he's never been to before from a God he doesn't worship on ridiculous promises. They're ridiculous promises, folks. And what did Abraham do? He obeyed. He responded to this initial call and drawing of his life out of this pagan world. He responded. It was an active faith. It was a response. It was an obedience. You say, well, God doesn't call it faith here in this text. No, God calls it faith in Hebrews, though. Flip over briefly and keep your finger in Hebrews. We rarely do this. But if you look back at chapter 11 of the book of Hebrews, we find Abraham stepping out in obedience, but it was an obedience that was rooted and motivated in faith. Chapter 11, verse 8. By, what's your Bible say there? By faith. Now, God doesn't say that in Genesis, but God is saying that here. By faith, Abraham obeyed. The response of obedience was preceded by a heart of faith, is what God is telling us through Hebrews. I'm not giving any kind of a quality to this faith. All I'm saying is God in Hebrews 11 is calling it a faith that results and responds in activity. Look at verse, keep going. When he was called out to go to a place that he was to receive as an inheritance, and he went out not knowing where he was going. Who would do such a thing? Two tracks. God's sovereign nudging. Other track, man's response of faith. But it was a faith that responded in activity. If Abraham stayed in Ur and said, I believe you, God, and went about his Ur business, was that faith? Their answer is no. It's like you tell your kids, clean your room. If you don't clean your room, then this is the consequence, curse. If you do clean your room, this is the blessing. And they're like, I hear you. Yes, I believe you that you will curse me if I don't clean my room. Yes, I believe you that you will bless me if I clean my room. You come back an hour later, their room hasn't been touched. And they said, didn't you hear me? Yes, I heard you, Dad. Don't you believe me? Yes, I believe you, Dad. And they're sitting on their bed playing a game. As a parent, do you think that they believed you? No. Do not separate faith and the responsive activity of faith. Abraham here has some level of an initial responsive activity called faith in the book of Hebrews to God's sovereign, gracious nudging. Now, let me just kind of pause and say at this point, obviously great care needs to be applied anytime we step back into the Old Testament and try to take that Old Testament character and push it and make it fix and fit our New Testament understanding of salvation. But we got to be very careful how we do that. And while I've got ideas and thoughts, at a minimum, here's our takeaway at this point, and that is this. You, church family, and particularly some of you, are here because God graciously called you out of paganism. For some of you, God literally reached down through his Spirit into your heart and your mind and began drawing you and calling you. I'm trying to use words that are similar to our New Testament language using an Old Testament character. By God's grace, he began drawing you and calling you. And for some of you, it was out of extreme worldliness and paganism. But you're here this morning, aren't you? And you're here this morning because of God's sovereign unction in your heart and your responsive, faithful activity. It is a faith that led you, that drew you out of paganism. It is he and your response of faithful activity that transferred you from the kingdom of darkness into the kingdom of light. I'm not saying at this point, our New Testament language, that Abraham is what we would call saved. I'm not saying that. And we'll talk about that in the next point. All I'm saying at this point is there is some parallelism, and all of us can relate to Abraham, and we're here because God drew and called us out, and there was a response of faithful activity. That's the first photo. Second photo that we need to look at here is in Genesis 15, and that is this: his faith is alone. Chapter 15. Now, just by an aside here, when you talk about the Abrahamic covenant, if you're familiar with that, you've got 4 chapters that really deal with the Abrahamic covenant. Chapter 12, chapter 15, chapter 17, and chapter 22. All 4 of these chapters pertain to the Abrahamic covenant. It is at this point in Genesis chapter 15 that I think we see another photo, and that is his faith is alone. Follow along with me if you would. Chapter 15, verses 1 through 6. After these things, the word of the Lord came to Abram in a vision. Fear not, Abram, I am your shield. Your reward shall be very great. But Abram said, O Lord God, what will you give me? For I continue childless, and the heir of my house is Eliezer of Damascus. And Abram said, Behold, you have given me no offspring, and a member of my household will be my heir. And behold, the word of the Lord came to him, This man shall not be your heir. Your very own son shall be your heir. And he brought him outside and said, Look toward heaven and number the stars, if you are able to number them. Then he said to him, So shall your offspring be. Key verse 6. And he, Abraham, believed the Lord, and he counted it to him as righteousness. All of the promises of God to Abraham can really hinge on this one promise: offspring, a singular seed. Some have estimated there are anywhere from 4 to 15 Abrahamic promises through the covenant God gave Abraham. 15. But all of those promises really only come to be if there is a kid, a son, if there is an offspring. Abraham had just received these promises, and he's like, I hear you, God. I hear you, God. I'm starting to doubt you, though, God. I don't know about this, God. How am I supposed to be a great nation if I don't have a kid? How am I going to have a land that is filled and multiplied and fruitful if I don't have a kid? How am I going to have a great name if I don't have a kid? How am I going to bless all nations if I don't have a kid? And what does God do? Patiently and graciously, this time, as opposed to chapter 12, where God had him count, if he could, the number of sand on the ground, he takes him outside in the starry night, and he says, look up. Count them. Count the stars. I highly doubt Abraham started counting them. But what we do know is something happened in Abraham's heart and mind. Scholars debate exactly what it was that triggered Abraham's heart and mind. Who knows exactly? Maybe it was he came out and see the Creator God who gives life and who gave the life of light. He was reminded again of who this God was. But what we do know, Abraham responded in, you tell me, faith. But it was a faith that was alone. That he was considered righteous. Abraham looked up at the stars, and something happened, and he said, I believe you, Lord. I believe you, God. I believe your promise that I will have a son. And it's at that moment that God valued Abraham's faith and credited to him righteousness. Meaning, an unrighteous man is immediately declared righteous by God based on the same reason as Abraham, and that is faith alone in God's promise. Paul will bring this out in the New Testament several times. Romans chapter 4, Galatians chapter 3, with an audience dealing with Judaizers who are trying to say, no, yeah, believe in Jesus, but also keep the law, particularly circumcision. And Paul goes back to this very moment in Abraham's life. And he says, no, let's go before the law. Father Abraham, let's go to him. Let's talk about Father Abraham. Father Abraham believed in the promise of God. And then it was at that point credited to him as righteousness. So it is anyone. Abraham set a precedence back then that to be right with God, you and I must have Abraham's faith. And Abraham's faith is this: there's absolutely nothing he can do or add to it by way of works to be considered righteous. That's why this is different than Genesis chapter 12. In Genesis chapter 12, with God's gracious calling, which Abraham responded with a faithful obedience, it still, though, is a faith that was coupled with what in Genesis chapter 12? Works. Abraham obeyed. That's a good thing, though, folks. Don't throw that out. But when it comes to being declared righteous by God as someone who is unrighteous, there's nothing that can accompany your faith in God's promise. Let me peel this back one more. Hang here, this is important. Okay, so stay with me. This is another this is the ridiculous promise. The ridiculous promise is this: Abraham, you're going to have a son. What's the problem? He's as good as dead. Not just him. She is too. They are past the childbearing years. It's hilarious, literally, to Sarah. They're as good as dead. It's impossible. It is not realistic. There's no science that can change this, right? It's gone. There's no way. Abraham can't do a thing to make this happen. But yet he believes. He believes God's promise that life can come from death. The life of Isaac can come from death. Sarah and Abraham. And Abraham believed it. And God said, I credit you my righteousness. Abraham experienced a righteousness at this point that is precedent setting for all throughout God's history that Paul touches on. It is the same means and basis by which we are credited righteous, and that is exclusive, alone faith in God's promise that you and I get life from death. In the immediate fulfillment, it is Isaac. In the future ultimate fulfillment is another son, and that son is Jesus Christ. There is a greater Isaac to come, in Jesus, the Son of God, who would lay down his life for us if we would believe. Believe what? The impossible, the ridiculous. That when we die, we have and will have eternal life that begins now through the Spirit of God. But we will have life from death. Do you believe it? It really is ridiculous. It's almost unbelievable. And if you believe it, guess what? You are declared righteous, which means you're right with God on the basis of Jesus, and you have it now. You have already experienced this transference from kingdom of darkness to kingdom of light through the Spirit of God in you, but we are awaiting the time when, after these carcasses die physically, we will receive our eternal life. That is the promise of God given to all his people who respond in faith and faith alone. problem is life happens, though, doesn't it? Life happens. Which brings us to our third photo found in Genesis 16. Follow along as I read verses 1 and 2. Now Sarai, Abraham's wife, had borne him no children. Uh-oh. I mean, just let that sink in. No children still. But she did have a female Egyptian servant, whose name was Hagar. And Sarai said to Abraham, behold, now the Lord has prevented me from bearing children. You see what she's doing? God didn't come through. God's not answering his promise. She proceeds to say, go into my servant Hagar. It may be that I should obtain children by her. And Abram, unfortunately, listened to the voice of Sarai. You see, there does come in the life of God's kids fear, uncertainty, doubts, and the promises of God. And when this happens, it's inevitable, this feeling of helplessness, this vulnerability, which then translates into us taking matters into our own hands and taking control. And that's what's happening in this scene. Sarai and Abraham are taking matters into their own hands. They're going to try to work the promise of God into fruition, into happening. But God's promised blessings come only by grace, only through faith, not works. Do you see the contrast with the preceding chapter in this chapter? It's by grace alone. Abraham's like, I get it, I got it, I see it. You're righteous. And then 10 years goes by. No answer. They're feeling alone. What about these promises that were given to you, Abraham? I'm not saying anything here. They begin to doubt. They're uncertain. They take matters into their own hands. And God, in order to demonstrate this truth and protect Abraham from pursuing the covenant through Ishmael after Hagar and Abraham have Ishmael, God allows and even encourages Hagar and Ishmael to be what? Sent away. And he took care of them, by the way. Not only did he take care of Hagar and Ishmael, he made a great nation out of Ishmael. But in sending Hagar and Ishmael away, he removed that occasion of susceptibility to continue to rely on human works and not faith. God wanted to make sure that Abraham understood that the attainment of the promises of God comes by faith. And so Ishmael and Hagar were sent away. And we have then chapter 17. We won't take it, but it's the circumcision chapter. You're welcome, I'm skipping it, right? But that's a reminder, by the way, a sign and seal of the covenant. Like, you want to take matters into your own hands? Okay, we'll make this ugly. We'll make this gruesome. We'll make this gross. Snip, snip, right? And it is this sign and circumcision that is twofold. See what happens when you take matters into your own hands. And be reminded that this is not works, the means to receive my covenantal blessings. It is by faith and faith alone. And so when times get shaky and uncertain, we all do well to remember that receiving life from death only comes through faith and not works. And this wasn't the first time Abraham had incidents, is it? Chapter 12 and chapter 20, what's Abraham do? Throws Sarah under the bus. She's not my wife. She's my sister. Other pagan kings are like, well, thank you very much. What does God do? He steps in sovereignly, graciously, to preserve his covenant of Isaac to Abraham by pulling Sarai out of that precarious situation that Abraham put her into. God preserved, he protected Abraham's covenant even in spite of his faithlessness, which means this. Church, we might have faith in God, but we still at times act faithlessly. Don't you? Genesis chapter 15. Abraham is declared righteous. 12, 20, 16. Abraham does stupid. He's faithless. But God is still sovereignly in charge, graciously moving and leading Abraham to protect his covenantal promise and blessing upon Abraham in spite of his faithlessness. Because God is always faithful. God is not expecting, careful how I say this, God understands that people who have expressed faith in him will also express at times and seasons in their life doubt in him. But God continues his redemptive plan even through Abraham's faith and faithlessness at times, which is why Genesis chapter 21, 1 and 2, we find the answer. The Lord visited Sarah as he had said, and the Lord did to Sarah as he had promised. See, I showed up. I answered, God says. And Sarah conceived and bore Abraham a son in his old age at the time which God had spoken to him. The fulfillment of the promised seed is dependent upon God's faithfulness. But it is, however, not void of our human responsive faith. Let me say that again. We're almost to the fourth point. We'll be done. The fulfillment of the promised seed, Isaac, is dependent upon God's faithfulness. Everybody get that? But it is not void of human response of faith. Rather, his faithfulness is seen in working in the life of Abraham's faith so as to increase his faith. Said another way. Is God going to accomplish his plan with Abraham? Yes or no? Because he is, and he is faithful. That's this rail of the train track. Is man's response of faith necessary? Yes, it is. That's the other track. You have me nervous there. Grace Bible Church. Absolutely. God's sovereign grace, man's response of faith, considered righteous. But is the covenant of God dependent on man's faithfulness? The answer is no. But God's. Oh, okay. Well, then I can read the paper, sign the line, say what I need to say, stick the saving grace faith card in my pocket, and live how I want, faithlessly. And the answer is no. Why not? Because God's good. And I think the answer to that question comes in our fourth photo. God's good. He's faithful to work on your faith. Look at chapter 22. Fourthly, his faith is advanced. Yes, I rarely do this. It kind of worked out. We did the alliteration thing. Hopefully that's helpful. You probably won't see it again. I did use Webster on the third one. A miss. That stumps me for a bit. Look at 22, 1 through 13. We'll read this. Read these three verses here. Follow along. After these things, God tested. Ooh, don't you hate that word? You'll come to love it. God tested Abraham and said to him, Abraham. And he said, here am I. And he said, take your son, your only son, Isaac, whom you love, and go to the land of Moriah and offer him there as a burnt offering on one of the mountains of which I tell you. So Abraham rose early in the morning, saddled his donkey, and took 2 of his young men with him and his son Isaac, and he cut the wood for the burnt offering and arose and went to the place of which God had told him. On the third day, Abraham lifted up his eyes and saw the place from afar. Then Abraham said to his young men, "Stay here with the donkey, and I and the boy will go over there and worship. And, don't overlook this, we'll come back." And Abraham took the wood of the burnt offering and laid it on Isaac his son, and he took his hand, the fire, and the knife. So they both went together. So Isaac 7 said to his father Abraham, "My father," and he said, "Here am I, my son." He said, "Behold the fire and the wood, but where is the lamb for the burnt offering?" Abraham said, "God will provide." God will provide for himself the lamb for a burnt offering, my son. So they went, both of them together. When they came to the place of which God had told them, Abraham built the altar there and laid the wood in order and bound Isaac his son and laid him on the altar on top of the wood. Then Abraham reached out his hand and took the knife to slaughter his son. But the angel of the Lord called to him from heaven and said, "Abraham, Abraham." And he said, "Here am I." And he said, "Do not lay your hand on the boy or do anything to him, for now I know that you fear God, seeing that you have not withheld your son, your only son, for me." And Abraham lifted up his eyes and looked, and behold, behind him was a ram caught in a thicket by his horns. And Abraham went and took the ram and offered it up as a burnt offering instead, substitutionary, of his son. While Abraham's faith is imperfect, God is in the business of perfecting our faith. It is amiss, but it is advancing. It is progressing. 15 years later, after the birth of his son, the one and only son, in whom the promise was made, which he waited for, the son comes, the promise of the seed comes, and now 15 years later, God says what? Now kill him. He tests him. What is God testing? His faith. His faith. And Abraham's faith had grown. This is a different guy, isn't it? This is a different guy than the one who threw his wife under the bus a couple times. This is a different guy because his faith had grown in the Lord, particularly in the promises of God through Isaac, to the degree that the author of Hebrews says that in faith he offered up his son, fully aware and assured that even if he went through and killed his son, what would happen? God would bring him back to life. That's amazing faith. That is a progressive faith. What we have here, don't get tripped up with these words now, is in chapter 22, we have the justification of a justified man. It is the manifestation, it is the demonstration of faith in 22, which was declared of him in 15, which was initiated and inflamed to some degree at his calling. And so it is through this life of Abraham, a maturing and progressing faith. It is a faith that eventually results in the ascertaining of the certain promises of God. You got it. You got the promises, the point. Our life in Christ is similar, right? I appreciated Christian's prayer. As we step back into the Old Testament characters, how is our life similar? Because two things never change: God and man. God remains faithful. Man does not remain faithful. So how do we get back to pre-fall relationship with God? It is only by the grace of God responded to in faith. And as believers, as sons of Abraham, who are recipients of the promise of God, we are blessed. Do you understand that here? Paul will talk about the gospel preached to Abraham in Galatians chapter 3. And this is where we come in, as we circle back around. It is through Abraham's covenant of Isaac a seed that becomes a mighty nation called Israel, that it is through Israel that Gentiles are offered the gospel of Christ to be responded to in faith and be declared righteous like Abraham. And as we are declared righteous by Abraham, we do the Christian life and we fall, don't we? We fail, don't we? We doubt God's promises. Namely, we fear death. This text comes along to encourage our faith in the promise of God through Jesus as the one who brings life from death. Which brings us to our big idea that we close with, and that is this, which is more of a statement that I think we should all just maybe hear state together, and that is this: I am believing in God's gracious promise of life from death, for life, because of Jesus' life. When you and I said yes to Jesus, we trusted in him. When we boil it down, here's what you trust him for. This might be informative, or this might be a reminder. And that is this: you are trusting him for life from death. Did you know that? You say, well, I prayed a prayer and asked Jesus in my heart. Why would you do that? No, seriously, why would you do that? Like, what? So you asked him into your heart for what reason? You asked him into your heart. You fell on your face. I'm an unrighteous person. I need your righteousness because of this reason. It is only when I have the righteousness of God on the basis of Jesus Christ and trusting in his work that I am having life from death and will have life from death. It is the promise of everlasting life, church. That is the good news. Do you believe that? Do you believe that? I'm going to ask actually the music team, hopefully no one's like out running around here. Let's go ahead and stand, and we're not going to close out in a prayer, but I want to transition, whoever's doing music, come on up. Let's stand together now, all of it. All of us stand. There we go. A little different this morning. Here's what I want to do. Let's get past, so I know we got, just kind of listen up here before we sing out. Let's get past simply being content with a justifying faith. Meaning, let's make faith alive. Let's persevere in a clinging to God for a progression of our faith. Faith is not just something we did once and we're done. The Christian living is a faith that is alive, that lives itself out every day. So, like, you got to say it in a bunch of different ways to make sure no one's like, I don't know about that. I'm trying different ways here. That's what Abraham experienced. Real life that tested his faith, that caused him at times to doubt God's promises. This takeaway statement, I am believing right now. Can you say that of yourself? I am believing. Are you? I am believing in God's gracious promise of life from death for and throughout life because of Christ. Because of Christ's life from death. And the only reason is because God's grace, which we respond to in faith, and so we continue to cling and hold on to him as he holds on to us. Let's close out singing this morning.